All right, Jack, welcome to the podcast. It's 11:06 a.m. on Tuesday. So if anything crazy happens between now and when this is posted, don't blame me, blame Jack for not knowing the future. How you doing, Jack?
Good. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be back on the podcast airways. It's been a little bit. Finished up football season, and now we're full swing for some hoops. Can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, we really are in full swing. League titles are going to be decided not too long from now. The rankings are definitely in full swing as well, and that's going to be our first topic. Is just kind of the gap between some of the top teams in these rankings and the rest of the field. So let's start with the boys and that side because there's a fun race in the top four or so, and then talk about the difference between them and the rest of the field.
Yeah, the what I've noticed from games I've seen, both games I've seen and games that I've just kind of witnessed going on throughout the Bay Area is that the teams in this top 4 or 5 range in the boys are a cut above the the girls, or excuse me, the rest of the field. So I had the girls rankings open. They're a cut above the rest of the field. And we saw it with Reardon and St. Ignatius last week. We saw it with Dublin and Ignacio Valley the week before that, and a Berkeley team that really had some good wins under its belt take a tough loss to one of the top teams in the Bay. So these top 5 teams: Salesian, Granada, De La Salle, Branson, and Reardon. And then you get into the Dublin, San Ramon Valley range, where you can say that those teams are putting together impressive wins too. But it's really those top 5 that have put together double-digit wins, 30, 40-point wins against other ranked teams. And so it shows me that the open division is kind of taking shape in that top 5, and that it's kind of a rich get richer scenario because Branson's not going to lose to Marin County. Midi, Salesian, they might trip up once or twice because they load up the schedule. But for the most part, those teams are going to have, fewer than 4 or 5 losses heading in the postseason. So those top 4 or 5 on the boys' side have been so dominant that it's been eye-opening.
What do you think that has been the main difference between those two teams and the rest of the field? Is there a distinct difference in their play style? What is it about those teams?
It's athleticism, size, and skill, obviously, but it's mostly just the fact that everyone can practice and get better and hone their skills. But there's the athleticism that those teams possess, and the depth of that athleticism has been really impressive. You look at a Branson team, for example, as a Jace Butler, Symmetry Carr, Finley Keefe, Joaquin Aguillon, and you get to like the 4th or 5th best player on their team, and they would easily be the number 1 scoring option on most other really good teams in the Bay Area. So the depth of that athleticism, the ability to run, dunk, play above the rim, and muscle guys inside the paint. I think just when you look at those 5 teams, that's why Granada's had a ton of success. They got a lot of size. They can bully people in the paint, dominating the rebounds. It's just a physical domination that can't be remedied by any sort of, nice shooting night or really, really strong defensive effort from a team that's just not as physically dominant.
And then let's move to the girls' side of things, where it really seems like it's Midi and everyone else. It's a story that we've heard before, but just kind of talk about those top teams and what Midi's been doing to separate themselves from the rest of the field.
Well, Midi, as historic as the program has been, you could argue that this start of this year is as historic as any other during Sue Phillips' tenure because they got that huge win on the non-league. I think it was Christmas, a couple nights before Christmas, maybe against Long Island Lutheran in that national tournament. That really kind of cemented them as not just the Bay Area's best team, not just Northern California, not just California, but the nation's best team as we head into 2024. So Midi behind kind of Wallachuk, and it's a cast of really strong and really well-disciplined players. You can always count on Midi's girls teams to be really well-disciplined, but this team, above all else, there's even a huge gap between Midi, who's number 1 in our rankings right now, San Ramon Valley, who's number 2. I would still take Midi by 25-ish points over San Ramon Valley. That's just how good they are, and that program's pedigree speaks for itself. I think they got countless players at some of the top Division I programs in the country, and they're cut above. It's almost reminiscent of De La Salle football's run years ago in the Bay Area, where there's not a true contemporary.
What about everyone else? It seems like number 1 is locked up, but what is that race for number 2 looking like with SRV sitting there right now?
Well, there's a really compelling race in the East Bay, and not just the East Bay, but the EBAL. San Ramon Valley is number 2, Carondelet's at number 4, and then Acalanes is number 3. So those 3 schools who kind of share a similar neighborhood are really strong in the Bay Area and have been steamrolling all their Bay Area competition in the non-league slate. Most of those losses, San Ramon Valley's 12-1, Acalani's 11-3, Carondelet's 11-1. Most of those losses are out of area powers. When they play Bay Area teams, they win, and they win convincingly. So these teams have separated themselves. And there's the next cut kind of down from that. You get to the Sacred Heart Cathedral, Cardinal Newman. Cardinal Newman's had a really strong start to the year. We can talk about them a little bit more when I get to the league races segment in a couple minutes here. But those kind of top 10 teams, you got a Bishop O'Dowd and Oakland Tech when you go back into the East Bay, like the Oakland League too. There's a lot more parity there in the 2 through 9 range than there is in the top spot.
All right, and then we want to go over to the Bay Area success in some of these big area tournaments. We already talked about Midi getting that big win over one of the top teams in the country. Just kind of talk about the success that the Bay Area teams have had in out of area tournaments.
Yeah, we talked about Midi girls getting that win. You had De La Salle going down and beating Los Alamitos. You had Granada beating Bishop Gorman out of Nevada in a tournament that was down in LA. Reardon beat Bishop Gorman as well. And these teams are kind of not putting the Bay Area on the map, because everyone knows that hoops is pretty good in the Bay, but definitely showing that this could be a huge Northern California and Bay Area year in high school basketball. These out of area wins. You have teams even in a more small scale out of area win. You have a couple teams beating St. Mary Stockton. You had Granada beating Sheldon. These Sacramento teams that are really good. Showing that these Bay Area teams kind of have the upper hand on the rest of the state right now, and even some of the SoCal powers. So I think it's important. It's not as important in their league wins and their league standings and their section standings from a practical standpoint, but just from a mental, emotional area superiority standpoint, the Bay Area has been showing out at these national invitationals.
And another thing that you pointed out is how good the defense has been, but scoring starting to catch up. Where do you see the basketball kind of turning into from early on in the season till now?
Yeah, it's kind of like in baseball. Oftentimes, you hear about how pitching always starts the season hot, and the bats need to catch up. That's what I've noticed in this high school basketball season. A lot of low scoring games. You see totals in the 40s. Sometimes even teams pulling up in the 30s in a lot of these evenly matched games. In a couple of tournaments I went to, even our tournament, the West Coast Preps Winter Classic, I was at the Callan Memorial up in Petaluma. Just a lot of missed shots, even on good looks. So that was something I knew would be, water finds its level and people will rise and regress to the mean. And that's started to happen the last week. We've seen a lot of higher scoring games, especially in the WCAL. You had, Reardon and SI up in the 70s. Teams are starting to hit shots. I think offense is starting to run smoother. Chemistry is starting to really become more of a factor. Teams are introducing players who had to sit out for transfer. Teams are getting people back from injuries, and they're beginning to kind of discover their offensive identity. So I think some of those rock fights and low scoring games we saw early in the season, we'll still see those because there's always going to be intense defense in league play and teams that want to slow the game down. But I think the overall shot making and scoring ability of these teams is something that's going to continue to increase as we head into January and February.
You mentioned some of those league races. What are your favorite ones that you're really looking forward to as we head into league play?
Yeah, I'll start up in like the far North Bay, which leagues in Sonoma County that don't get a ton of basketball love, because when you think of those schools like Cardinal Newman, Windsor, etc., you think football because they play football up there. You think baseball, they produce a lot of good baseball players. There's good basketball up there too, and I think the North Bay League Oak Division race this year, you got a Montgomery team that's really good, really compelling. They started outside of our rankings, but have since worked their way in after a really good showing at the Bambauer Classic at Marin Catholic last week. So a Montgomery team and a Cardinal Newman team on the boys' side that are going to be duking it out all year. Cardinal Newman has a couple of really young guys, a freshman and a sophomore who see significant playing time. So as those guys get kind of cultivated into the varsity basketball landscape, I think they're going to be a really compelling team down the stretch. Montgomery's got Caden DeVries, who's probably the best player in Sonoma County that I've seen. A cut above just in terms of athleticism and shot making ability. And their coach, Steve Arrow, is saying that he's a fourth year varsity guy that has really made big leaps this year. And I alluded to the EBAL girls race out in the East Bay with Carondelet and San Ramon Valley. Those two teams are going to be duking it out. It really is kind of a two-dog fight in there. Cal's a pretty good team. You got other teams that are going to maybe nip at the heels of those two, but those two are going to be absolutely duking it out for that EBAL title and NCS positioning too for the section and state tournaments. And just to touch on the South Bay and the Peninsula a little bit, and the WCal, both the boys and the girls side are going to be awesome races. We've already seen Reardon and Mitty put up big wins on the boys side. St. Ignatius had a huge win over Reardon last week in a game I was at, in which SI scored 5 points in the first quarter and ended up with 57 for the game, which is, a pretty high girls total for sure. So they are a really solid team that knows how to make adjustments in game. So both sides of the WCal race are going to be really compelling, and I'm super excited to see it play out and kind of have a front row seat for it.
Perfect. I love that. Don't get used to this. We're going to let you go over your 10-minute allotment here, only
I
because
knew I was close.
you were close. You're at 11 minutes, I think, right now. But I believe in your rant. So go ahead and give us your rant about boys and girls.
I'll make it quick because it doesn't need a ton of window dressing. But boys games and girls games should be played on the same night at the same site. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense where like I alluded to, being at St. Ignatius last week for the girls game. The boys game was at the same time at Reardon, so pretty sparse gym for the girls game, which really kind of sucked for the girls because one, those are two really good girls teams, and two, they were putting on a really nice show. It was a really dramatic late league game that I think if it had been a 6 o'clock start at Reardon before the boys game, by the time it's the third, fourth quarter of that girls game, that gym is packed and rocking, and both student sections are supporting the girls teams just as hard as they support the boys teams. So it's I say it selfishly because I'd want to cover both games. It's easy to hit two in one night. You can't really do that when they're at opposite sites. But also just in terms of supporting girls and women's sports. Um, when faced with a choice like that, students are going to gravitate towards the boys game. But if the girls game is before, you get more support for the girls who work so hard to put a good product out there and who are putting out a really good product. I saw it firsthand with that SI Reardon game. So for the WCAL and for all other leagues, I know some leagues do it. Where I grew up in Marin County, they did it that way, and I always loved the environment that the girls got before the boys games. And so if possible, think about maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but down the line, whoever's planning the structure of these type of things, get the girls and boys games on the same night, and even do boys games before girls games if you want to really switch it up, because the girls deserve all the support the boys are getting.
Perfect. Thank you, Jack, very much. Read all of his content on westcoastpreps.com. And until next week, we'll see you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.